Ready here.
We're talking this week with former U.S. Ambassador to the Congo, Alan Lukens. He's also a U.S. Army veteran of World War II. His 20th Armored Division was on the site as the Dachau concentration camp was liberated in late April 1945. And sir, you were just telling us one more story about the camp itself before we hit the break.
Well, let me jump ahead. Having walked around, being mobbed by these poor fellows who were the average age weight was down to 80 pounds. There was a lot of typhus there, and our officers right away said not to feed them too much. Their stomachs couldn't take it, although we were tempted to hand out food. And they were also worried, our leaders, that we would pick up typhus. So basically all of the American troops, pretty much all, were moved out of the camp within 24 hours and headed down toward Munich. That's what happened to us. Then I'm going to come back to what happened 50 years later, if this is the time to do that.
Go for it.
I went back for the first reunion in 1995, 50 years later. It was a big, big affair. A close friend of mine who in my company, and I went over there, and we kind of piggybacked on the group of the 42nd Division. There were about 100 of them. There were only 2 of us and one other from the 20th Armored. We'd never been officially even invited. But it was quite an affair. The night before, there was a Versailles-like castle built by King Ludwig in downtown Munich, where they had quite a dinner. We were invited to it because I knew our consul general and ambassador. And curiously, I sat next to a German general who was head of all the medical corps. And he asked if I wouldn't come and talk to some of his students a few days later. And I said I would. And that was kind of a bizarre experience. I was picked up at the hotel by a German colonel. Kind of frightened me, the idea. Drove out, had lunch with a whole lot of German officers, and then he asked me to speak to about 200 young Germans, men and women, both medical lieutenants, and tell them what had happened. They presumably knew pretty good English because my German was pretty weak. But so I explained everything that had happened, and at the end got a big round of applause, so hopefully it was effective. But it was kind of a change, being scared of any German 45 and suddenly being driven around by a colonel.
Before the liberation, sir, how much did you personally know about the existence of concentration camps or death camps?
Almost nothing. Stars and Stripes had something about Auschwitz, but that was an entirely different area. Mm-hmm. As you know, their reunion, 70 years was yesterday. Right. Auschwitz was pretty much, it was in Poland, it was pretty much Jewish. The prisoners in Dachau were only about 16% Jewish. They went way back from German Protestants and various people that Hitler didn't like, thrown in as early as 1933 when the camp opened. Then they threw in gypsies, homosexuals, anybody they didn't like over the period. And then when the invasion of Russia took place, hundreds of Russians were captured. This was an awful thing. The Russian officers were sent to Dachau, and they were told, an event that is still repeated history each year, that about 4,000 of them, supposedly, if they would run down the field and get away, they would be freed. And they did, but they were all shot in the back. It was just a real murder scene. And each year when we go back to what had happened, there's always a little bit of a part with the Russians involved, remembering that awful incident. All right, what they've done in the camp since, They have a beautiful new chapel, basically a Catholic chapel, but it's used by the Protestants, a Jewish one, a synagogue, and a Russian one, all sort of side by side. They've kept one of the barracks as a symbol. The others have been cleaned up. And there's a visitors center and cafeteria and everything now, and a museum. There's a very impressive German lady that runs it. What is interesting is that they are making it, and they have since '95 made an enormous point of making requiring German kids, high school and college, go through the whole scene. So a tremendous number of Germans have been brought up as a requirement to go in and visit the place, in addition, of course, to many foreign tourists.
Holocaust denial is a crime in Germany, correct?
Yeah, it's a crime, although that's a difficult problem because if they do something, technically it's a crime. If they talk about it, it could be or not. That's another argument going on in Germany right now. But anyway, the big event that night was meeting the survivors. My friend spoke German, so he talked to a lot of Poles and Eastern people that only spoke German, and I spoke French. And that's when I found, again, sort of by accident, a number of French people that survivors that I've got to know. One particularly, and that's a separate story, maybe get into that in a minute, who's since died, and his son is still a very close friend, and 2 or 3 others that I've kept up with. But what they went through was just, some of their stories, just unbelievable. At the very end, the Germans wanted to hide what had happened in the other camps, and that's the reason that they sent all these poor victims down by train. They were alive when they put them on the train, to get them away so that presumably the Westerners wouldn't see what had happened. And the other crazy idea was that they would have a last-ditch action down in Bavaria, even a guerrilla warfare to stop, to hold on, and Hitler, even though he'd been advised by some of his generals to give up, he refused to, so they were going to have a last-ditch fight there. And there was one bizarre incident at the end. First of all, these people on the train who were still living had to walk about 4 miles to the camp, and they were shot if they fell by the wayside, and they had dogs chasing them and everything else. And then for those who were still mobile, they were supposed to go up into the mountains behind Munich. And there was a death march starting from Dachau up the hills. And one interesting thing was that these prisoners were required to push carts. Turns out that the carts were full of civilian clothes, and the Germans were ready to shed their uniforms and jump into these clothes. When they got partway up the hill, just a Frenchman who was there told me about this. The French just realized what was happening, and they certainly mutinied, they shot their German soldiers who were there, and they grabbed the clothes themselves and hid out until the Americans came about a day later. But there are a lot of different stories, and some are unbelievable. I mean, they had a count every morning to see how many people were at each barracks of the prisoners, and they were very rigid. The SS, they would count the people, and all the food, little food there was, depended on how many were there. And when my friend had said that after people died during the night, they would hold the bodies up just to get more rations uh, because of the numbers. So there were a lot of different stories, but perhaps that gives the picture. But
it certainly does. Sir, just a few minutes left in our conversation.
yeah.
How did that experience, how did your war experience overall influence your attitude towards your diplomatic work later in life?
Well, it got me using the French, and not so much the later on, because I was already a diplomat. No, but it interested me enormously. I'd grown up interested in what was going on. My parents were Anglophiles and Francophiles, and my father had been in the First War and the Second, and it was very interesting. And I just I won a Time Current Events prize twice, I guess, in my school, and I always got interested. So, and then I kept a diary all the time I was in the war, and I just knew that I wanted to get back into that kind of thing as soon as I could.
Throughout your diplomatic career, from the early 50s to the late 80s, the overarching problem in the world, diplomatically of course, was the Cold War. You were at various stations, from Turkey to Paris to the United Nations to several different nations in Africa, Denmark, South Africa, and then eventually ambassador to the Congo. How did you approach the Cold War in general and all of those different posts as the Cold War wound its way through those decades?
After a year in France and Spain together, I went back. I taught school for 2 years, got in the Foreign Service at 51, in 1951, and went to Turkey as my first post. The first year I was assistant cultural officer in Ankara, and the second year cultural officer promoted in Istanbul. It was a wonderful period of U.S.-Turkish relations, and they'd been with us in Korea, and it was in all of history in the last 70 years or so. It was the nicest period to be in Turkey, the most pro-American, and we made lots of friends. And it was the Cold War then, what they were afraid of was Russia. And so everything the arms that we began to send them and everything we did was all, they were all poised against a possible Russian invasion. And you'll remember that the Truman Doctrine supported Turkey and Greece against a possible invasion by the Russians.
Sure.
So that was my first taste of the Cold War, I guess you'd say.
Which post did you enjoy the most?
Well, it's hard to say, because I had hoped to stay in Turkey. I learned a lot of Turkish, but that came to an end. I was suddenly invited or ordered to be consul in Martinique. Couldn't have been a bigger change because of my French. So I did that for a couple of years. That was hardly Cold War. People in Washington got panicked because the mayor of Fort-de-France, named Aimé Césaire, was known to be a communist. He wasn't any more communist than I was, and I remember visiting him all the time, giving him books about Lincoln and whatnot. Anyhow, after that, I came back. I was in the press division of the State Department. I did a certain amount of speaking there, not always about the Cold War or anything. And during that time, I was sent up to the UN for 3 months to help out one of the political ambassadors. Curiously enough, had been the president of Indiana University, where I've been. And then after a couple of years of that, sorry,
take your time.
They asked for somebody who spoke good French to go to NATO, to the international staff, which was then in Paris. And that was very interesting. And to be actually in the international staff with, curiously, a German boss of all things. But it was fascinating, and I took some courses there. I got an advanced degree at the Sorbonne because the work at the NATO wasn't all that difficult. And I had originally showed an interest to going to Africa, and suddenly one day I got a cable or a telephone call that the consul in Brazzaville to 4 countries in Central Africa had died of a heart attack, and so he said, "You asked me, you said you were interested in Africa someday. Well, here's it." So that was it. So I was sent right down there, and that's where I have perhaps one of the most interesting parts of my diplomatic career.
Great.
So arrived there a couple of months later. 1960 was known as the year of independence in Africa. Nigeria got its independence in the summer of '60, or earlier than that, actually. Finally, de Gaulle said, well, first of all, the Belgians decided to give independence to their big Congo. And they did so rather hastily. They hadn't done much homework to get people ready for it. They formed a government at the last minute of a President Kasavubu and the Prime Minister named Lumumba. And their independence was the 30th of June, 1960. And they put me, although I was across the river, as consul for 4 countries in Central Africa. I was put on the delegation along with the Undersecretary Murphy and Mr. Paley, who was head of CBS, and some others. And we all sat up there on June 30th, 1930, as the independence, King Baudouin was granted to the big Congo. What amazed us at that point was to see these black troops, the Force Publique, led by Belgian, mostly Flemish, non-coms, doing the goose step in a kind of an eerie way, as a way the Germans used to. And we just said to each other, you know, this can't last like that. Well, 8 days later, I got a call at 5 in the morning. Hurry down to Le Beach, it was called, across Stanley Pool in Brazzaville, because there's been a mutiny of the black soldiers, and the Europeans and Americans are all fleeing across the river. It was only about 3 miles on these old ferry boats. So that started a very extraordinary period in my life, because pretty soon the Air Force flew down 2 enormous planes with helicopters inside. There was no communication possible except, curiously, by the walkie-talkie from my porch across to the embassy. Everything, all the lines had been cut. The embassy over there was totally cut off. And we got the only time in my life when I could say I ran an Air Force for a couple of days. And we flew these missions, not we, but the Air Force, into the interior of the Congo to save some of these missionaries who were very naive. Some had been there for years. They said, our blacks won't touch us, but they found that was wrong. So we had to pull them all out and get them out of Brazzaville. We put them up on our floor. We saved food for a couple of years of ourselves down there, but we went through that in a hurry, and we had dozens of people sleeping in the consulate. And we sent plane load after plane load of refugees out. Not so many Americans, but there were hundreds of Europeans. Anyhow, eventually they all got out of there, and that got calmed down. And the next thing was de Gaulle decided, well, he wasn't going to be far behind, but he had the naive, I mean, he wasn't naive, but he was the thought that if he gave independence to all of his countries, there were 4 in Western Africa and 4 in Central Africa, they would continue to be very close to France. And Andre Malraux, who came down at the independence, who was Minister of Culture, gave this motherly speech. You know, when you're 21, you want to be your own boss, but you're not going to turn over your wonderful parents. Same speech he gave 4 times in a row. So it was during the campaign between Nixon and Kennedy, and nobody was particularly interested. And I kept saying, who's going to come and represent us to these independences? And nothing happened. And I wrote a long speech to be given to each president, and they came back and said, well, that's okay, you have to do it. So finally I was sent to be the representative to 4 different independences that took place every 48 hours in the summer of 1960, and that was quite a thrill.
Sir, unfortunately, we're just about out of time. We got about 90 seconds to go.
All right.
And so we obviously can't get to your full diplomatic career.
All right. Well, that's the most exciting part.
but just to wrap it up, from the time that you first put on the uniform of the United States Army in 1942 to the late 1980s when you ended your diplomatic career, what has it meant to you to serve your country?
Well, I got a wonderful letter from Reagan saying, you've given 40 years of your life to the to work for your country, and we appreciate it. A very nice letter from Reagan, because it was almost 40, counting the military and the diplomatic. So, did we run out there?
We're pretty much out. So.
Well, anyway, I could sum it up in a couple. So after that, I went to. I opened the embassy in the Central African Republic. I was there only a few months when my mother had come down to help my wife and 3 kids get to London for another baby, and the plane was fell down. We don't know whatever happened over Algeria, so they were all killed. And after that, I was assigned back to Paris. And had the good luck to meet my wonderful wife, and now we've been married 52 years, wow. 4 kids and 10 grandchildren. Wow. So that was another very unbelievable part of my life, which I thought should be part of this.
Absolutely. We thank you for sharing that. I know that had to be a most difficult time for you, and we thank you for your incredible service to our nation, sir. Thank you for your time today as well.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry I didn't cover everything, but I probably talked too long.
Oh, that's all right. There's so much to cover. There's only so much you can do in 35 minutes. Just let me finish it up by saying the following. Our guest this week has been former U.S. Ambassador Alan Lukens, who served in the U.S. Army in the 20th Armored Division in World War II and participated in the liberation of the Dachau concentration camp. I'm Greg Corombos. Thanks for listening to Veterans Chronicles.